I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled, U.S. President Trump Streamlined the National Endowment for Democracy, Not Dismantle It. And this is a topic that I've tried to raise awareness for all along. It was obvious from the very beginning that President Trump, his administration, had no intention of dismantling any of these regime change tools the U.S. has used for decades and decades. Some of the most effective tools that it actually has to undermine and overthrow targeted nations around the globe. This was never going to happen. This was what is called a limited hangout, where you realize the public, the American public, the global public are increasingly aware of what the NED or USAID are doing. They know about it. They're angry about it. They're beginning to organize themselves against it. So what you do is you admit to some of these things. You even volunteer additional information about what is going on. And you pretend that you address it, when in actuality, all of it continues. And in the minds of the general public, these organizations have been dismantled, even though in reality, they continue operating to this day, better concealed, streamlined, more effective. So I'm going to read this article. This is for people who don't feel like reading it themselves. This is an article that I wrote about an important topic that I would do analysis on regardless. I will give you additional information when and if necessary, and I will show you all of the sources that I cited while writing this article. So while many believe that under the Trump administration, the controversial National Endowment for Democracy was defunded, dismantled, or otherwise dissolved, the reality is far less dramatic and far more dangerous. I would say it's much more dangerous now than it has been in the past, because people who were aware of it, in their mind, they believe it's already been addressed, when in actuality, it's worse now than ever. Despite President Donald Trump's outspoken criticism of global entanglements and calls of ending the era of endless wars stretching all the way back to his first term in office, the NED not only continues to receive taxpayer funding under his administration to facilitate instability and conflict worldwide, it has quietly expanded its reach behind a newly adopted policy that makes its activities less transparent than ever. Transparency is a very important word here. The whole reason the National Endowment for Democracy was created in the first place was because back in the 70s and 80s, there was growing public awareness of this central intelligence agency, the CIA, and covert regime change operations the US was conducting all around the globe. And because people were aware of this and they opposed it, they did their own limited hangout back then. They admitted to some of this and they pretended they addressed it. They created the National Endowment for Democracy, and the key difference between what the NED did and the CIA had been doing was the idea of transparency. We're going to tell you all of the groups, all of the countries, all of the groups we're giving this money to. It's transparent because it's promoting democracy. It's not regime change. It's not political interference. We're promoting democracy. So they took covert regime change and they transformed it into promoting democracy. It's still covert regime. It's still regime change and political interference. It's not promoting democracy in any shape, form, or way. But that's how they marketed it. That's how they rehabilitated the image of the covert operations the CIA had been conducting. We know this because the Western media admitted this all the way back in the 80s and 90s. This is a New York Times article from 1997. Political meddling by outsiders, not new for the US. And it talks all about the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy. All the way back in 1986, this New York Times article, Missionaries for Democracy, U.S. Aid for Global Pluralism. And it's all about how the CIA was doing all of this covertly. The NED is completely different because they're doing it openly. At the end of the day, what they're still describing is the U.S. spending money and resources to interfere in the internal political affairs of sovereign nations in violation of international law. They always call it promoting democracy, when in reality, democracy is a process of self-determination. So if there is an opposition group where everything is being determined and directed in Washington, not in this targeted country the US is interfering in, then that's not democracy. That's just plain political interference, even if you're calling it democracy. And this is the game that the US has been playing for decades and decades. This notion of promoting democracy is absurd because it goes against the very definition of what democracy is in the first place. So let's continue. On its official website, the NED recently revealed what it calls a... So for years and years, the NED has been interfering in all of these countries, claiming that it's not interference, it's promoting democracy, and it's a good thing. And if it wasn't a good thing, why would we be so transparent about it? We're transparent. If you talk about Thailand, look, this is 2014. These are all the groups we're admitting we're giving this money to these groups, and they all have words like democratic and human rights in their names. So how could this be a bad thing? But now, while in many people's minds the NED has been dismantled and no longer exists, it still exists. Website is still active. If we search the programs they're funding in Thailand right now, this is all you get right here. 29 projects, so they claim. $2.8 million, so they claim, and that's the only information that you get in regards to Thailand. Now, how do you go from this and being so transparent to this? Zero transparency. All we know is the US is spending money on interfering in Thailand's internal political affairs. That's all we know. We don't know which specific groups they're funding. What happened? I will tell you what happened. And this was something that was in the works for years. This was a transition that had been taking place all throughout the Biden administration, and it just culminated under the Trump administration. The idea that the Trump administration dismantled the NED was all part of reframing the whole organization and how it works. Basically trying to sweep it under the rug. It's still there. It's still there. I just showed you the website is still there and active. On its official website, the NED recently revealed what it calls duty to care. This is their new policy, duty to care, an internal shift that effectively ends the organization's long-standing practice of openly listing most of the foreign organizations and movements it finances, because even though they claimed that they were transparent, they were still groups they would never admit to funding. You would find the evidence buried somewhere online, but they would not disclose it on their website. This change, framed as a protective measure for recipients in high-risk environments, marks a complete reversal of one of the few things that previously distinguished NED operations from covert CIA influence campaigns, the veneer of transparency, because it wasn't actually ever really transparent. It was the veneer of transparency. But now even that has been discarded. Now the NED is carrying out covert political interference around the globe. No transparency at all, just like the CIA had been doing. It's almost as if it has come full circle, but more accurately, I would say this is evolution. I'll explain why here in just a moment. So a pro-democracy front with covert DNA. Let's talk a little bit about where the NED came from. I touched on it a little bit, but I mention it in the article. Founded in 1983, the NED was created to do overtly what the CIA used to do covertly. This is according to former NED co-founder Alan Weinstein. For decades, oh, by the way, that quote is from this old Washington Post article from 1991, Innocence Abroad, The New World of Spyless Coups by David Ignatius, who launders CIA propaganda. He's been doing it his entire career. He's still doing it to this day. And this is all about how the NED is promoting democracy around the world. The CIA was doing it covertly. Now the NED is doing it more transparently. And it's the same ideas with that this New York Times article that I just showed you. For decades, it served as the US arm of so-called soft power, funneling money to foreign political groups, media outlets, labor unions, and activist organizations deemed favorable to US interests, usually under the banner of promoting democracy. But democracy, in this context, is indistinguishable from regime change. In other words, democracy is just a euphemism for promoting regime change. They're not promoting democracy. From Venezuela to Belarus, from Hong Kong to Myanmar, here in Thailand where I am based, any defunded groups have played central roles in political destabilization and even precipitating war, many of them advocating positions explicitly aligned with US foreign policy and done entirely at the cost of their own nation's stability and best interest. You will see these NED-funded organizations, these opposition movements, the US has created and directs, just literally destroying their own country, burning it to the ground, physically burning it to the ground. What they're doing in Myanmar right now, they are destroying the entire country. What they did in Libya and Syria, they have destroyed those two countries. Those are two destroyed countries. That is what all of this always leads to if allowed to run out of control. Ukraine is another great example. The NED was active in Ukraine since the end of the Cold War. Some might argue the CIA was involved all throughout the Cold War in Ukraine. Look at Ukraine now. That is the end result of all of this democracy promotion. The obvious purpose of creating the NED wasn't to end covert interference around the globe, but rather to continue the CIA's work Americans and people worldwide were increasingly aware of and opposed to by whitewashing it and repackaging it as transparently promoting democracy. Since the NED's founding, the Western media has intermediately admitted the NED has been involved in global spanning regime change. In 2004, the London Guardian admitted the US government through the NED overthrew governments in Serbia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, while unsuccessfully attempting to do so in Belarus and Ukraine. That is this article right here that I have referenced many, many times. They explicitly tell you that it was an American, all these protests, it was an American creation. It is marketing. It is interference. It is rabble-rousing. It is not democracy promotion. They're admitting to it here. What they're describing is not promoting democracy. It is removing governments the US doesn't like and replacing them with client regimes that will be obedient to Washington and its interests. That has nothing to do with democracy. The article described unrest taking place in Ukraine at this time, 2004, as, this is a quote from the article, an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years, so not just in Ukraine, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes, which is just, again, a euphemism for removing governments that are pursuing their own interests and installing client regimes that will respond to our interests, even if it's at the cost of the targeted country. That is what that's a euphemism for. The Guardian continues, funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, 2 big American parties, US non-government organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe, in Belgrade in 2000. Richard Miles, US ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role, and by last year, as US ambassador in Tbilisi, repeated the trick in Georgia. So this has nothing to do with promoting democracy. This is just US regime change. The article names the National Democratic Institute, NDI, and the International Republican Institute, IRI, and Freedom House by name, all 3 of which are subsidiaries of the NED. This George Soros Open Society is an adjacent organization that works in tandem with all of these NED subsidiaries and related organizations as well. In 2011, the New York Times, they wrote this article right here. US groups helped nurture Arab uprisings, 2011. The article explained a number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republic Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House. So everything mentioned in that Guardian article from 2004, mentioned again in 2011 in regards to the so-called Arab Spring. The article also said the Republican and Democratic institutes are loosely affiliated with the Republican and Democratic parties, US parties. They were created by Congress and are financed through the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up in 1983 to channel grants for, again, promoting democracy in developing nations. The National Endowment receives about $100 million annually from Congress. Freedom House also gets the bulk of its money from the American government, mainly from the State Department. And now, under the Trump administration, a lot of this has been consolidated even further under the US State Department, although it was mainly run by the State Department all along Anyway, what are they describing? What is the London Guardian and the New York Times describing? They're describing movements in targeted countries that are completely funded and directed by the US. So again, it's not democracy if everything about these movements are being decided by and are dependent on Washington. It is simply political interference. You are dressing up as promoting democracy. The US engineered Arab Spring would precipitate multiple US wars across the region. That was by design, ravaging Libya, Yemen, Syria, and affecting every nation in between. US political interference continues up to and including today under the current Trump administration, with attempts to once again destabilize the nation of Georgia along Russia's borders, continued US-sponsored violence in Myanmar, along China's borders. That is a raging conflict that continues uninterrupted since President Trump took office. They're receiving overt and covert support from the US government through a variety of vectors. Attacks by US-backed militant groups in southwest Pakistan targeting China's Belt and Road Initiative, and the continued operation of virtually every NED-funded organization operating elsewhere along China's periphery, including here in Thailand, also in the Philippines. All of this is continued. A lot of people supporting the Trump administration who cheered on the Trump dismantling USAID and the NED are oblivious to the fact that the NED and USAID continue to operate and are indeed operating in absolutely all of these places they were working before President Trump took office. Now it's being done under this new cloak of secrecy where now it's going more unnoticed than ever. And it's going to take even more effort to draw attention to this now. Because a lot of people have actually gone back to sleep. I have often said that once people wake up to these things, they cannot go back to sleep to it. But in fact, this is what the US has succeeded in doing, getting people to go back to sleep regarding the NED and USAID and affiliated organizations. Let's talk about democracy as a cover for political interference, although I've been harping on this entire time. Democracy, by definition, is a form of self-determination. If a political movement relies on or is shaped by the funding and direction of a foreign government, especially one with a track record of overt military invasion, occupation, and conquest like the United States, it is not promoting democracy, but rather political interference. Any nation whose internal political affairs are subject to the influence of the US government through the NED, its subsidiaries or adjacent organizations, is not exercising democratic self-rule, but living under a subtler form of political occupation, one where ballots replace bullets. But the end result is the same, the replacement of sovereign leadership with a US-installed client regime. That is exactly how the US invasion of Iraq turned out. So again, it doesn't matter whether the US military physically invades. The end result is the same. The US has overthrown a targeted government one way or the other and has installed a client regime in its place, whether they used US soldiers to storm in, invade, and occupy the country, or they armed a bunch of thugs and terrorists to do it. It is the same outcome. In many cases, US NED-funded and directed instability takes the form of armed violence amid which activists, they're always called activists, rather than invading US troops, seize critical government buildings, attack critical infrastructure, and carry out other objectives an invading US military force would seek to achieve, including the destruction of specific infrastructure and the ousting of ruling governments. So I just said that. And if you look, say, in the amid the violence in neighboring Myanmar here in Southeast Asia, if the US could, they would love to just bomb the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative everywhere it's being built up. The US would love to just bomb it, but they can't. So what they do instead is they arm terrorists to do it for them. And that's what they've been doing. In Myanmar, they've been attacking pipelines and roads and dams. In southwest Pakistan, they're killing Chinese engineers and attacking the port there in Gwadar in southwest Pakistan. This, again, it's the same outcome. It doesn't really matter if it's a US jet dropping the bomb or a US-backed terrorist planting a bomb. It is the same outcome. And so when you're talking about national security around the globe, you need to protect your nation not only against the threat of the US doing this through military means directly, but also their ability to do this indirectly, through proxies, through the CIA, through the NED, through USAID, and as a matter of fact, all of these threats combined, working in tandem. The end of transparency, and I have it in quotes because it was never real transparency to begin with. It was just the illusion, the veneer of transparency. The NED's decision to stop publishing the identities of the groups it funds represents more than just an administrative shift. It is a turning point following years of growing public awareness both in the US and worldwide of what the NED is really doing and why. Many people across the alternative media have been exposing the NED and USAID. So it wasn't the Trump administration that came out and exposed all of this. It was already being exposed. The Trump administration conducted a limited hangout to manage growing awareness and, as a matter of fact, convince people to go back to sleep regarding it. That's what the Trump administration did. In the past, critics were able to track and expose how NED money was flowing into particular movements, from opposition parties in Nicaragua to protest organizers in Hong Kong. And as a matter of fact, for many, many years, I have been reporting on this, and I have this complete guide, U.S. government role in Thailand's student protests. This was all the way back in 2019, 2020, and I was exposing all the documented evidence regarding the U.S. backing these opposition leaders and the groups that they were part of. And again, a lot of this was just openly disclosed on the NED's website. Even though it was disclosed openly, a lot of people still didn't realize it. They weren't aware of it. And even as I was exposing it, they were still skeptical of it. Here's the protest, one of the protest leaders literally at the U.S. embassy with the U.S. ambassador to Thailand at the time. So part of these so-called activists as part of these U.S.-funded groups becoming politicians in U.S.-backed political parties. And it just goes on and on and on and on. Their interference in local universities, across the media. And it was hard even then to raise awareness of this, even though the US, through the NED, disclosed a lot of this on their website. Now it's going to be even harder to convince people this is going on because you don't have that hard evidence, that transparency that they were attempting to kind of hide behind, even if that sounds paradoxical. So the NED's decision to stop publishing the identities of the groups it funds represents more than just an administrative shift. In the past, critics were at least able to track and expose how NED money was flowing into particular movements, from opposition parties in Nicaragua to protest organizers in Hong Kong or Thailand, like I just showed. That visibility, however, minimal, imposed some form of political pressure and constraint on the US if there were enough people exposing it. That's important to also point out, because in many cases, all of this information was available on the NED's website, but nobody in these targeted countries were talking about it or exposing it. With the duty to care policy, and I think we should go to that page. So this is the current NED website, April 25th, 2025. So this is after everyone thought the Trump administration dismantled the NED. Still there, still operating, uninterrupted. And this is all about no longer disclosing their funding, who they're funding. Okay, so it says protecting partners on democracy's front lines is a core institutional commitment that guides the National Endowment for Democracy. Our duty to care and public disclosure policies reflect how we safeguard those working in high-risk environments while upholding the transparency and accountability of our mission requires. So the NED holds itself to high standards of transparency and accountability. Our public disclosure policy reflects these values while recognizing our duty to care obligations in response to the real-world risks faced by our partners. We disclose information to fulfill statutory requirements and congressional oversights, demonstrate responsible stewardship. At the same time, so all of these things that they claim they're disclosing funding, but there is no disclosure now. At the same time, our approach is partner-driven. We only publicly share grantee or partnership information when doing so is consistent with their security, consent, and the objectives of their work. We do not publish names, locations, or project details that could endanger individuals operating in hostile environments. So I guess according to them, in Thailand, they're all involved in high-risk activity that cannot be disclosed. So the entire Thai program, $2.8 million at least, all secret, Cannot disclose it publicly. Will not disclose it publicly. So with this duty to care policy, even the veneer of transparency has been eliminated. Today, the NED operates with the same impunity as any covert intelligence operation, only without the oversight, legal restrictions, or classification protocols typically associated with the CIA activity. So it went from CIA to NED and transparency to now a combination of CIA covert activity and I wouldn't even say at this point veneer, the myth of transparency at this point. There's not even a veneer of, there's a myth of transparency. In the past, critics were at least able to track and expose how NED money was flowing into particular movements, from opposition parties in Nicaragua to protest organizers in Hong Kong, or even here in Thailand. As I have pointed out many times before, as I just showed you, this was the page in 2014. And so when there were US-backed political instability in Thailand, I used to be able to go here and show people, those organizations are not just pro-democracy movements. They are funded by the US government to destabilize Thailand. That went from that to now in 2025, this right here. This is all they're disclosing now. And if you go to their duty to care and public disclosure policies, they're saying, yes, we're transparent, we disclose everything. And then down here it says, unless, right here, we only publicly share grantee or partner information when doing so is consistent with their security, consent, and the objectives of their work. So they're not disclosing anything at all about their program in Thailand, except that the program exists and that money is being spent targeting Thailand's internal political affairs. So there's zero transparency. So they're not even pretending to be transparent anymore. Let's continue. With the duty to care policy, even that veneer of transparency has been eliminated. Today, the NED operates with the same impunity as any covert intelligence operation, only without the oversight, legal restrictions, or classification protocols typically associated with CIA activity, and the same stigma attached to it. If you're still somehow able to figure out that an opposition group here in Thailand is funded by the NED, it does not have the same stigma associated with it that getting money from the CIA would have. The NED used to be more transparent. It used to be much easier to find out who was funded by the NED. So now they've kind of, it hasn't gone full circle from covert CIA activity to transparent NED activity back to covert CIA activity. Now they've combined the best of both worlds. The NED is doing everything covertly, but if it is ever found out, it's the NED that's funding them, not the CIA. So there's no stigma attached. Although now it is much harder to find this information and expose those being funded by the NED. In practice, this allows the US to wage political war under the pretense of promoting democracy, while overall leaving fewer fingerprints behind. So there's even fewer fingerprints now than ever before. Plus there's this plausible deniability that's associated with the funding going through the NED rather than the CIA. Very dangerous. Like I said, it's much more dangerous now than ever before. And while the shift within the NED and across US foreign policy as a whole should prompt nations to respond with stricter scrutiny and regulations of the organizations still likely receiving US support, even when US interference was more transparent, many nations failed categorically to protect national security from it. Now that US interference is being done more covertly, it'll be even more difficult for advocates of greater national security regarding foreign-funded NGOs to spur governments around the world into action. So this is not progress. This is US interference around the globe becoming more sophisticated and better hidden. That's all that has happened. So that brings me to the second to last part of the article. Under Trump, business as usual, continuity of agenda, if you will. Despite the perception among some the Trump administration intended to dismantle or defund the NED, no such action occurred. In fact, NED funding is continuing after only a brief pause, with the majority of NED operations continuing uninterrupted. I am here in Thailand. I track all of the organizations that have been funded by the NED over all of these years. Not one of them had their operations interrupted by whatever was supposedly going on in Washington between the Trump administration and the NED or USAID or any of these organizations. It continued uninterrupted. There were local elections across Thailand. and you could see the US-backed political party running up and down the streets, just like they've been doing all of these years. Much like the US military-industrial complex, which continues expanding despite President Trump's rhetorical opposition to forever wars, the regime change industrial complex led by the NED, its affiliates and subsidiaries have likewise not only continued, but are enhancing their menace to peace and stability worldwide. That's what this is. It's enhancing their menace, not undermining it. Some may argue that recent attention placed on the NED and adjacent organizations like the USAID is positive progress in the right direction. In reality, the recent attention has more in common with what is known as a limited hangout, a method of perception management used when state secrecy has been compromised and limited information is either admitted to or even volunteered, while central information is still withheld from the public. The public is often distracted by or satisfied with this limited admission and fails to pursue the issue further. So to a lot of Americans and a lot of people around the globe, President Trump dismantled the NED. It's a done deal. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be fine. In reality, the NED has become more secretive, less transparent, and it is still funding opposition groups all around the globe. It has become more dangerous. That is how limited hangouts work. In the case of the NED and in the case of NED and USAID funding, after many years of growing awareness of and opposition to both, many Americans believe both organizations have now been dismantled. Oblivious, both are still operational, and the global network of political subversion they facilitate continues operating uninterrupted. A hidden hand with open consequences. So all of this is becoming more secretive, but the consequences will still be very noticeable. The NED's new era of covert funding and hidden recipients marks a dangerous evolution in US foreign policy. Under the guise of care and caution, the organization has closed the one window that allowed even limited public scrutiny of its global interference, and that was only because of the alternative media, but now it's going to be harder than ever. Regardless of whether the CIA or NED fund and direct foreign interference worldwide, and regardless of the degree of transparency involved, the outcome remains the same. A world where real decisions are not made by people on the ground in any one of the many nations targeted by US interference, but by politicians in Washington and policymakers at corporate-funded think tanks. While American voters and many around the globe held hope that the incoming Trump administration would make good on its promise to roll back US interference abroad and focus instead on the best interests of Americans in America, the administration has instead continued US wars and proxy wars in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, together with sharpening and streamlining the military and non-military means with which to expand them even further. Despite the illusions of reform or even revolution under the Trump administration, the truth is the NED and USAID remains as active as ever, more unaccountable than ever, and continues to serve as a sophisticated instrument of political manipulation for the very special interests of the deep state many Americans voted President Trump into office to oppose. So there you have it. People voted President Trump into office to fight the deep state. He has helped cover it up, streamline it, make it more efficient at doing what it has been doing that have created so much opposition to it in the first place. That is what is actually happening. This is what has happened under the Trump administration. I look forward to all of the excuses by people who still insist that President Trump is somehow fighting the deep state, rather than obviously working for it and surrounding himself with representatives of it. I look forward to their explanation as to what has happened. I have heard people try to argue with me that President Trump he tried to defund the NED, but they brought him to court and the judge decided in favor of the NED, so he tried. But in reality, you know, the first thing the NED is going to do is bring you to court and challenge your decision. So if you had nothing planned after that to pursue, once they brought you to court and the judge decided in their favor, then you weren't really serious about ending their funding in the first place. If you want to know what a country looks like when a real leader takes charge and takes the country back from corrupt special interests, look at Russia after the Cold War. Russian President Vladimir Putin got all of the oligarchs into a room together, and he told them, you're going to either work for the nation and its interests, or you're going to make plastic folders in a camp in Siberia, or you can flee the country and never come back. Those are your options. Those are your options. Pick from those options. And then they did. And many of them worked for Russia and its interests, transforming Russia into the re-emerging power that it is today. Others decided to continue working against Russian interests for their own greed, and they ended up making plastic folders in Siberia or fleeing the country to the West. And that is how Russia took its country back from these corrupt special interests. That's what you would actually need someone to do in the United States. That is not what President Trump is doing. President Trump is just pretending he's fighting the deep state. All of the people that he picked in his administration are representatives of the deep state. They are neocons. They are warmongers. They are people who are literally at the head of these corporations and financial institutions that constitute the deep state. And they're the ones who funded his campaign to get into office in the first place. So that's not how real change looks. For nations around the globe, they need to take this threat seriously. It is more dangerous now than ever because it is more hidden now than ever. It's going to be very difficult to expose any defunded sedition here in Thailand, for example. Again, I'm going to show you again. This is all I've got to go off of now. And I'm going to have to do more digging than ever to expose it. And a lot of what I have to depend on is showing that the organizations operating today, many of these are still operating today. There are disclosures from the past archived on the internet. They've been erased from the NED's website. I can show that. That's about as good as I can do. And this is actually extremely alarming and dangerous. This is not a step forward. This is 2 steps backwards. And so we're going to have to work harder now than ever to expose U.S. interference. We're going to have to work harder than ever to convince people that President Trump is in on it rather than in any way opposed to it. He has facilitated and helped cover for all of this that has just taken place. So that is the article. That is my video. I will keep a close eye on this. I've been covering this for years. I will continue covering this into the future. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I also have listed all of the links, including the article that I read from. All of those links are in the video description below, as are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. Those links are in the video description below. For people who have been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no spare resources and you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what helps make this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.